My best friend set up a kidney surgery for me without my permission, saying real sisters share organs. When I begged her to stop, she just smiled and said, "I've already decided which one of your eyes I want to." I stayed quiet. That was 10 months ago. This morning, she collapsed in the courthouse hallway, screaming my name as the judge signed the restraining order. I thought I knew what friendship was. We were blood sisters from 2nd grade, an unbreakable bond forged in scraped palms. But then, my best friend decided that wasn't enough, and she started planning to literally harvest my organs to make us truly one. Daisy and I met when she moved in across the street, and immediately, she bit both our palms until they bled, pressing them together, declaring us blood sisters. Even then, it was intense. Her family, you see, they were obsessed with biological connections. Like, truly believed that shared DNA was the only real form of love. Daisy's mom was their poster child. She'd donated a lung to her sister, a kidney to her cousin, and she'd parade her surgical scars at every family gathering like they were battle wounds from some glorious war. Daisy grew up convinced that anyone who didn't share organs was just playing at being family, that real love, true love, required surgical proof. It was chilling, even as kids. Throughout our childhood, Daisy would plan our entire medical future, down to the most disturbing details. She kept these thick binders filled with organ compatibility research. She'd drag me to health fairs, insisting I take blood tests so she could confirm we were matches. She'd draw diagrams of our bodies, showing exactly which organs we'd swap and when, creating literal timelines for our surgical bonding. At sleepovers, I'd wake up covered in string because she'd been practicing surgical knots on my arms while I slept. Every single month, she'd make us prick our fingers to test if our blood still mixed properly. If it seemed to clot too quickly, she'd panic, genuinely panic. Her bedroom walls? Covered with medical posters featuring smiling transplant patients, who she called the truly bonded ones. Her obsession, already intense, absolutely exploded when her older sister died waiting for a liver transplant that never came. At the funeral, Daisy grabbed my face, her eyes wild, and whispered, "That will never happen to us. We're going to preventatively share everything before it's too late." She immediately plunged into researching which organs could be donated while still alive, and then, she created a schedule. It started with a kidney, then a partial liver, then bone marrow, then skin grafts. She wanted us to be walking, breathing proof that love meant literally carving out pieces of yourself for another. When I tried to, gently suggest we could just be regular friends, she would sob, utterly distraught, claiming I clearly never loved her if I wouldn't share my spare organs. It was emotional blackmail on a level I couldn't even comprehend. In college, things somehow got even worse. Daisy started dating a medical student who, instead of helping her, actively enabled her obsession. He taught her all sorts of medical terminology, let her watch actual surgeries online. She'd call me at 3 in the morning, her voice buzzing with excitement, describing intricate kidney removal procedures, saying how easy it would be for us to finally become real sisters. It was terrifying. Then she started forging my signature on organ donor cards. She registered me for medical studies without my knowledge. I'd start finding hospital brochures hidden in my apartment that she'd clearly left, and my insurance company actually called me about pre-surgery consultations I'd never scheduled. Daisy had been impersonating me to medical professionals, building this elaborate case history that I wanted to donate my organs. The whole situation finally exploded when Daisy announced she needed a kidney because hers were failing. And you won't believe how they were failing. She confessed she'd been taking black market drugs for years, deliberately damaging her own kidneys to force our surgical bonding to happen sooner. "Now you have to give me one," she said, showing me her test results, a perverse triumph in her eyes. I made myself need you. The sheer audacity, the premeditation of it, was sickening. When I refused, she went ballistic. She screamed that I was murdering her after everything she'd done to create this opportunity for us to finally merge. It was horrifying to realize she'd been systematically destroying her own body for years, all just to engineer a situation where I'd have to donate to save her life. I fled to my boyfriend Marcus's apartment, my heart pounding out of my chest. But Daisy had already been there. She'd broken in. She'd left medical equipment everywhere, alongside consent forms for kidney donation that she'd filled out in my handwriting. She'd been practicing forging my signature for months and had created an entire paper trail showing I'd eagerly agreed to donate. There were emails from my account to various transplant centers, all expressing my fervent desire to help my best friend. She'd even stolen my passport and driver's license to submit with the applications. Then Marcus found her journal. The pages detailed how she'd been slipping me medications during our monthly dinners to test how my kidneys processed various substances. The betrayal, the violation, was absolute. Daisy started stalking me with increasing desperation as her kidneys got worse. She'd show up at my work with 4 bags attached to her arm, a skeletal figure, accusing me of killing her with every day I delayed. She broke into my apartment again, and I found her in my bed, surgical markers in hand, drawing incision lines on her side where my kidney would go. She'd actually hired a black market surgeon who was willing to do the transplant without proper consent if she could just get me sedated. I changed my locks, but she'd made copies from impressions she'd taken years ago. The police wouldn't take it seriously. She just seemed so sick and pitiful. They called it a misunderstanding between friends. One night, I woke up to Daisy standing over my bed, a syringe clutched in her hand, and two men in surgical masks lurking behind her. "Don't worry," she whispered, her voice chillingly calm as I tried to scream. "Dr. Samuel says he can have your kidney in me within 4 hours. I already paid him with my college fund." I fought back, thrashing, but one of the men grabbed my arms, pinning me down while Daisy approached with the needle. "You're going to save me whether you want to or not," she said, her eyes gleaming. "And after this, we'll schedule the liver portion." As the needle got closer to my neck, she smiled, a predatory, possessive smile, and uttered the words that still haunt me, that still wake me in a cold sweat. "I've already picked out which one of your eyes I want, too. We're going to match completely." The needle was maybe 6 inches from my neck when Marcus, my amazing, brave Marcus, burst through the bedroom door. He tackled the bigger masked man into the dresser, shattering it. The syringe flew from Daisy's hand. I rolled off the bed, scrambling, desperate, for the window. My bare feet hit broken glass from a picture frame as I yanked the window open and squeezed through. Onto the fire escape. The metal was freezing against my skin, slicing into my feet, but I didn't care. I could hear Daisy screaming behind me as I started climbing down. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, dropping down to the next landing. The operator's voice was calm, a stark contrast to my gasping address and incoherent pleas about kidnapping and surgical masks. My feet were bleeding by the time I hit the alley, but I could still hear crashes from my apartment above. I ran toward the main street, the October Portland rain instantly soaking through my pajamas. Behind me, Daisy's voice echoed down the alley, a guttural shriek. "You're killing me. Come back." The sidewalk was empty at 3 in the morning, and every shadow looked like another masked man. I ran until I saw the police lights turning onto my street. When the officers finally made it up to my apartment, they found Marcus sitting against the wall, blood running down his face from where the dresser mirror had shattered. One of the masked men was gone, vanished, but the other was unconscious on the floor. Daisy had collapsed next to my bed, clutching her side, moaning about her kidneys. Surgical equipment was scattered everywhere, 4 bags, scalpels, and what looked like a portable anesthesia machine. The police called an ambulance for Marcus and Daisy, while I sat in the back of a patrol car, unable to stop shaking. At the police station, Detective Walsh looked skeptical. When I explained about the organ theft attempt, he kept asking if maybe Daisy was just confused from her medical condition. The nurse examining my neck found a small puncture wound, a raw red mark where the needle had grazed me before Marcus tackled the man. She took photos and swabbed it for evidence while I recounted Daisy's entire chilling obsession with organ sharing. He was writing notes, but I could tell he still thought this was some bizarre misunderstanding between sick friends. Then Marcus walked in. 17 stitches in his forehead and Daisy's journal clutched in his hand. He grabbed it from her bag during the fight. The pages were filled with detailed plans going back months, diagrams of my body with harvest sites marked, forged consent forms she'd been practicing, timelines for multiple surgeries. The detective's expression changed, slowly, chillingly, as he flipped through pages of Daisy's research on sedatives and black market medical contacts. He immediately called Elena Rodriguez from Oregon Health Sciences Hospital to verify the transplant paperwork. Elena arrived within an hour, carrying a stack of documents that made my stomach churn. She confirmed that 6 different consent forms had been submitted over the past 6 months, all with my forged signature. The handwriting was so perfect, so meticulously replicated, that even I would have believed I signed them. Daisy had scheduled me for pre-surgery prep in 48 hours, and the hospital had already reserved an operating room. The documents listed me as an eager living donor who couldn't wait to help her best friend. Elena said they'd only discovered the fraud when she called to confirm some medical history that didn't match their records. The next morning, they arrested Daisy at the hospital where she was getting dialysis. When the officers walked in, she immediately collapsed on the floor, screaming that I'd poisoned her kidneys to kill her. The medical staff rushed to help her while she sobbed, dramatically, about being abandoned by her sister. She told everyone that I'd promised to save her life and then changed my mind at the last second. Several nurses gave me disgusted looks as they wheeled her away on a gurney. It was infuriating. Back at my apartment that afternoon, I sat on the couch, numb, while Marcus changed every single lock again. My friend Rachel went through my things, searching for hidden cameras. Every shadow made me jump. Every noise sounded like someone at the door. Rachel found a tracking app on my phone that had been installed months ago. Daisy had been watching my location constantly, knowing where I was every minute of every day. We found 3 small cameras hidden in smoke detectors and air vents. She'd been watching me in my own home for who knows how long. The violation was suffocating. Detective Walsh called that evening to tell us that Dr. Samuels and his associates had vanished, probably fled to another state as soon as the police got involved. The surgical equipment in my apartment? Stolen from a veterinary clinic in Gresham 2 weeks earlier. The 2nd-grade blood sister pact really took a dark turn here. Most kids just share friendship bracelets, but Daisy went straight for the organ exchange program. Daisy was being held on attempted kidnapping charges, but her lawyer was already arguing that her medical crisis had impaired her judgment. He was claiming she couldn't be held responsible for actions taken while her body was shutting down from kidney failure. It felt like she was already getting away with it. 3 days later, I tried going back to work at the medical clinic, but everything felt different. My coworkers kept staring at me, whispering when I walked by. Some were morbidly fascinated by the drama, constantly asking for details about the attempted surgery. Others seemed to think I was heartless for abandoning a dying friend who just wanted to live. My supervisor pulled me aside and, with a sympathetic but firm expression, suggested I take a leave of absence until things calmed down. She said the situation was becoming disruptive to patient care. That same afternoon, Daisy's mother showed up at the clinic in a wheelchair, her body covered in surgical scars that she made sure everyone could see. She grabbed my arm and pulled up her shirt to show the massive scar where she donated a kidney to her cousin. "That's what love looks like," she hissed, her voice dripping with accusation, "giving pieces of yourself to save family." She demanded to know why I wouldn't do the same for someone I'd called a sister for 20 years. Security had to wheel her out while she cried, loudly, about how I was murdering her daughter. 2 weeks passed with no word about Daisy's case. I was just starting to relax, to breathe a little easier when I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar, with a smear of blood on the doorknob. My hands were shaking as I pushed the door open. Daisy's medical equipment was arranged on my bed, surgical tools laid out in perfect, horrifying rows. There was a note in her handwriting, chillingly calm, saying Dr. Samuels had contacted her and they could try again. She wrote that my kidney would be inside her by the end of the month, no matter what it took. Marcus called the police while I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind reeling. The detective arrived and told us Daisy had been released on medical grounds to her parents' custody. She was supposed to be wearing an ankle monitor and staying at their house. The blood on the door? It was hers. She'd been cutting herself, deliberately, to make her medical situation look more desperate. She'd been telling doctors that the stress of my abandonment was causing her body to reject dialysis. The detective assigned a patrol car to drive by my apartment every hour, but we all knew that wasn't enough. Elena called me the next morning while I was making coffee, and her voice was shaking. Someone had been calling. Transplant centers all over Oregon and Washington, using my name and social security number, trying to schedule donor evaluations. The calls came from different burner phones, but whoever it was knew my medical history, my blood type, and even mentioned specific doctors I'd seen. Elena said the person claimed to be me, insisting they wanted to donate a kidney to their best friend as soon as possible. 3 centers had already started paperwork before Elena caught wind of it through her network. She'd spent all night calling places to warn them, but more calls kept coming in. Marcus grabbed the phone when he saw me start to shake. Elena told him she'd already reported it to the detective, but there wasn't much they could do with burner phones. That night, Marcus found me at his kitchen table at 2 a.m, surrounded by medical websites about kidney failure. I'd been reading about dialysis schedules, transplant wait times, and survival rates without treatment. The browser history showed I'd been at it for 4 hours straight. Marcus sat down next to me and gently closed the laptop. I told him I kept thinking about Daisy dying and how everyone would blame me for not saving her when I had a perfectly good kidney she could use. He reminded me, patiently, that Daisy had deliberately poisoned herself to create the situation. A week later, Rachel drove me to a therapy appointment she'd set up with someone who specialized in manipulation and coercion. The therapist had me walk through every interaction with Daisy, all the way from childhood. She pointed out patterns I'd never noticed. Every blood sister ritual, every game of doctor, every time she'd drawn on my body with markers, it was all preparation. She'd been conditioning me since we were 7 to see my body as partially hers. The therapist showed me how Daisy had normalized the idea of sharing organs through constant repetition and relentless emotional manipulation. While packing clothes to stay at Marcus's place, I found a folder hidden behind my winter coats that I'd never seen before. Inside were Daisy's actual medical records from the past 2 years, showing she'd been taking immunosuppressants to prepare her body for transplant. There were receipts for the black market drugs she'd used to damage her kidneys, and notes in her handwriting about dosages and timing. She'd planned every detail, including which kidney of mine she wanted. She'd been suppressing her immune system for months to reduce rejection risk. The papers went back further than I thought possible. 3 days later, at 5 in the morning, Daisy showed up at Marcus's apartment building, dragging an 4-pole behind her. She looked like death itself, with sunken eyes and gray skin. She collapsed dramatically in the lobby just as the morning security guard arrived. When the paramedics came, she told them I was her medical proxy and had abandoned her during a health crisis. The building security footage later showed she'd been waiting outside for 3 hours in the cold, timing her collapse for maximum witnesses. At the hospital, they called me as her emergency contact and Dr. Foster was brought in to evaluate her mental state. Marcus and I watched through the observation window as Daisy sat calmly in the hospital bed, explaining her worldview. She said we'd made a blood oath at 7 years old and I owed her my kidney as part of our sisterhood pact. She insisted it wasn't crazy, but simply honoring the promise we'd made as children. Dr. Foster took notes as Daisy described how organ sharing was the ultimate expression of love and how I was murdering her by refusing. Dr. Foster recommended an immediate psychiatric hold. Detective Walsh called that afternoon with news about Dr. Samuels. Turns out, he wasn't even a real doctor, but a veterinarian who'd lost his license for doing unnecessary surgeries on animals. He'd been running an underground organ market for 3 years, targeting desperate people like Daisy who couldn't get legitimate transplants. The FBI was now involved because he'd crossed state lines, and they'd tracked him to a warehouse in Idaho where he had a makeshift operating room. 2 weeks later, Rachel came over with a box of our childhood photos she'd gotten from my mom. We spread them out on Marcus's dining table, and Rachel started pointing out things I'd never noticed. In almost every single picture, Daisy was touching me somehow or drawing on my skin with markers. There was one where she was measuring my torso with a ruler while I slept at a sleepover. Another showed her playing doctor, a real stethoscope pressed to my back while she took notes. Rachel even found a drawing Daisy had made when we were 9, showing 2 stick figures with their bodies connected by red lines labeled shared parts. It was all there, laid bare. That same week, I discovered Daisy had been posting on organ donation forums for months. She'd written dozens of posts portraying herself as a dying woman whose selfish best friend refused to save her life. She'd posted my first name and the city we lived in, and people had figured out who I was. My work email was flooded with messages calling me a murderer and saying I deserved to lose my kidneys by force. Marcus helped me screenshot everything and organize it into folders for evidence. Some of the messages included death threats and promises to find me and take my kidney for Daisy themselves. The restraining order hearing was 3 weeks after the hospital incident. Daisy's parents had hired her a lawyer who presented her as a terminally ill woman whose mental capacity was compromised by kidney failure. Daisy arrived in a wheelchair with oxygen tubes, even though the hospital records showed she didn't need either. She testified in a weak voice about how I'd promised her a kidney in high school and pulled out a contract she claimed we'd both signed. It was another forgery, but this one was on old paper she'd apparently been saving for years. The judge examined it while Daisy's lawyer argued that denying the restraining order would be sentencing Daisy to death. The judge looked at me for a long, heavy moment before turning back to Daisy and her lawyer. He picked up his gavel and said he was granting the temporary restraining order with conditions. Daisy would need to stay in psychiatric treatment at the state facility and couldn't have any contact with me through any means. As the bailiffs wheeled her out, she turned her head and mouthed the words, "You're killing me," while staring straight at me. Her lawyer started arguing about appeal options, but the judge cut him off and said the order would stand until the criminal trial. I left the courthouse feeling both relieved and guilty, watching Daisy's mom sob in the parking lot while loading the empty wheelchair into her van. That night, Elena called me with news that made my blood run cold. The hospital's IT department had been investigating some weird computer activity and discovered that Daisy's medical student boyfriend had given her his login credentials 2 years ago. She'd been accessing my medical records regularly and had actually added notes to my file, claiming I'd expressed interest in organ donation multiple times during visits. Elena said they found over 40 entries where Daisy had edited my records to make it look like I was eager to donate to her specifically. The hospital was launching a full investigation and had already fired the boyfriend for the security breach. I couldn't eat for days after that call. Just kept seeing Daisy's face when she mouthed those words at me. Even though I knew she was manipulating me, the guilt sat heavy in my chest, knowing I had the power to save her, but wouldn't. Daisy brought receipts to her own crime scene like she was planning to file them with her taxes. Medical supplies for kidnapping, deductible. The woman turned organ theft into a 2-year business plan, complete with drug schedules and body part selection, which is both terrifying and weirdly organized. Marcus found me at 3 in the morning hunched over my laptop, looking at legitimate kidney donation websites and calculating recovery times. He closed the laptop gently and held me while I cried about not knowing if I was a monster for letting her die or an idiot for even considering helping someone who'd tried to drug and kidnap me. 3 weeks passed before Dr. Foster called with an update from the psychiatric facility. She said Daisy had been responding well to treatment and the dialysis was keeping her stable. But during a routine room check, they'd found pills hidden inside her pillowcase. Testing showed they were the same black market drugs she'd used to damage her kidneys in the first place. Daisy was still actively poisoning herself to make her condition worse and force my hand. Dr. Foster increased her supervision, but said Daisy was clever about hiding things and they couldn't watch her 24 hours a day. The next morning, a package arrived at my workplace addressed to me with no return label. Security opened it first and found dozens of photos of me from over the years, my eyes scratched out with something sharp, and the word murderer written across each one in red marker. The security footage showed a teenage kid dropping it off, and when police tracked him down, he said a woman on an app had paid him $50 to deliver it. They added harassment charges to Daisy's case, but she denied knowing anything about it from her hospital bed. 2 days later, I was in a meeting when Dr. Foster called my cell phone repeatedly until I stepped out to answer. Her voice was shaking as she told me Daisy had escaped during a shift change that morning. They found a mannequin in her bed that she'd somehow gotten from the physical therapy department and dressed in her hospital gown. She'd stolen medical supplies, including sedatives, surgical tools, and enough pain medication to knock out several people. Dr. Foster kept apologizing and saying Daisy had been talking about completing the bond all week, but they thought it was therapeutic progress, not planning. Detective Walsh immediately started a citywide search while Marcus packed our essentials and drove us to Rachel's house across town. Rachel had a security system, and her neighbors were all retired cops who she'd already warned about the situation. The detective called that evening to say the FBI had spotted Dr. Samuels at a motel near the Oregon-Washington border, which meant he was probably coming back to Portland. They suspected Daisy had been contacting him somehow and planning another attempt. Rachel started going through the visitor logs from the psychiatric facility and noticed Daisy's mother had been there every single day, always bringing a wheelchair even though Daisy could walk fine. She called the facility and convinced a nurse to check the wheelchair, and they found a second cell phone hidden in the cushion along with a portable battery pack. The phone records showed calls to multiple burner numbers, and when they traced the connected bank accounts, they found cryptocurrency transfers totaling $30,000. Probably payment for Dr. Samuels to come back and finish what they'd started. My first panic attack hit me in the cereal aisle at the grocery store 3 days later. I saw a woman with Daisy's hair color reaching for a box, and my vision went black around the edges while my chest felt like it was being crushed. Marcus had to talk me through breathing exercises while other shoppers stared, and someone asked if they should call an ambulance. I realized then that I'd developed PTSD from months of being stalked and threatened. Even with Daisy supposedly contained, I was still jumping at shadows. 2 days after that, we were eating dinner at Rachel's when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera, we could see Daisy's mother standing there with a portable dialysis machine, tears streaming down her face. She was begging us to open the door, saying Daisy was dying in her car and just needed to see me one more time to find peace. When Rachel said we were calling the police, Daisy's mother started laughing this horrible, broken laugh and said it didn't matter because Daisy was already inside. She'd broken in through a basement window hours ago while we were all upstairs and was waiting for the right moment. Marcus grabbed a baseball bat from the closet while Rachel called 911 and told them there was an intruder in our basement who had already threatened to kidnap me for organ harvesting. We could hear sirens getting closer as Marcus slowly opened the basement door and shined his phone flashlight down the dark stairs. The smell hit us first. This sharp chemical odor, mixed with something sweet and rotten that made Rachel gag behind me. Marcus went down first with a bat raised while I followed close behind, even though he kept trying to push me back upstairs. The basement looked like a makeshift medical room, with 4 bags hanging from the ceiling beams and surgical tools laid out on my old ping-pong table. Daisy was slumped in the corner, surrounded by empty pill bottles and syringes, with photos of me taped all over the walls around her. Some pictures were from elementary school, others from last month, and she'd drawn red dotted lines on my body, showing where she planned to make incisions. Marcus checked her pulse while Rachel screamed for the paramedics who were just pulling up outside. Daisy's skin was gray and cold, and there was foam around her mouth that the paramedics said meant she'd overdosed on the kidney-damaging drugs she'd been taking. They worked on her for 20 minutes right there in my basement, pushing medications into her veins and doing chest compressions while her mother stood at the top of the stairs, screaming that this was all my fault. "You drove her to this," she kept yelling while the police held her back. The paramedics got Daisy's heart started again and rushed her out on a stretcher with her mother following behind, still blaming me for everything. Detective Walsh showed up and started photographing the basement setup while asking me how long Daisy had been down there. I had no idea, but Rachel found a receipt from a hardware store showing Daisy had bought lockpicking tools 3 days ago. The detective bagged all the medical equipment and took samples of the drug she'd been injecting herself with. At the hospital ICU, They put Daisy under police guard after the doctors confirmed she'd destroyed her kidneys completely with a black market drug. The nephrologist said she had maybe 3 weeks before total kidney failure would kill her without a transplant. Elena Rodriguez from the transplant center came to officially remove me from all the medical proxy documents after her investigation revealed 17 different forgeries with my signature. She showed me consent forms Daisy had submitted, claiming I'd agreed to be her living donor and had even scheduled the surgery for next Tuesday. The hospital's legal team was now reviewing every document Daisy had ever submitted to make sure no other victims were involved. I met with a lawyer the next morning who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. She looked through all my evidence and said Daisy's deteriorating condition actually made things worse, not better. Desperate people with nothing to lose are unpredictable, she explained while drafting a restraining order. She said we needed to prepare for escalation because Daisy would probably try something even more extreme once she got out of the hospital. 3 days later, Dr. Foster called to report that Daisy had been telling other patients in the psychiatric ward that we were spiritually connected and our organs were already metaphysically shared. She'd convinced several other patients to write letters on my behalf, portraying me as heartless for not honoring our blood bond from 2nd grade. Dr. Foster said Daisy genuinely believed I owed her my kidney because of the pact we'd made as children and saw my refusal as a betrayal of cosmic proportions. A week later, Marcus suggested we should leave Oregon entirely and start fresh somewhere Daisy couldn't find us. I refused. She'd already taken enough from me, and I wasn't going to let her take my whole life, too. We compromised by installing a sophisticated security system with cameras covering every angle of the house and adopting a large rescue dog named Bear, who'd been trained for protection work. The dog immediately became my shadow, following me from room to room and sleeping next to my bed. That same afternoon, Detective Walsh called with urgent news that made my blood run cold. Dr. Samuels had been arrested trying to cross back into Oregon with surgical equipment and a medical bracelet engraved with my name and blood type. He claimed Daisy had hired him for a retrieval procedure scheduled for next week and had already paid him $20,000 as a deposit. During his interrogation, Dr. Samuels revealed the full extent of Daisy's plan, which was even worse than we'd imagined. She'd promised him $50,000 total for my kidney, claiming she had power of attorney and that I'd changed my mind about donating, but was too emotional to go through proper channels. He provided emails showing Daisy's detailed plan to kidnap me during my morning run, perform the surgery in a rented warehouse she'd already secured, then leave me at a hospital with a note saying I'd volunteered, but didn't want credit. The warehouse had already been set up with surgical equipment she'd bought using her mother's credit cards. Detective Walsh said they'd found anesthesia, surgical tools, and even blood matching my type stored in refrigerators. The investigation expanded when 3 other women came forward with similar stories about Daisy from college. Daisy's mom bringing a portable dialysis machine to the door like she's delivering pizza? That's peak emotional manipulation. Nothing says guilt trip quite like medical equipment on your doorstep with a side of crocodile tears. One woman showed texts where Daisy had called her selfish for refusing to donate bone marrow after knowing each other for only 2 months. Another said Daisy had drugged her at a party and tried to convince her while she was high that they were meant to share organs. The third woman had actually gone to the police years ago, but they hadn't taken it seriously because Daisy seemed so sweet and innocent. All 3 women had eventually cut contact with Daisy after she became increasingly aggressive about organ donation. While reviewing old emails for the investigation, I found messages from Daisy's deceased sister, sent just weeks before her death. She'd been trying to warn me that Daisy wasn't actually sick, but was making herself sick on purpose. She wrote that Daisy had done the same thing to her, deliberately damaging her liver to force a donation, but she'd been too weak from the drugs to fight back. The sister begged me not to let Daisy guilt me into anything, because the organ sharing would never stop at just 1 kidney. 3 days later, I went with Detective Walsh to Daisy's childhood home to gather evidence for the criminal case. Her room was exactly how she'd left it, a shrine to our friendship, with walls covered in photos where she'd drawn surgical marks on my body with red marker. There were diagrams showing which organs we'd share and in what order, with dates planned out through the next decade. In her closet, we found medical textbooks with pages marked about tissue compatibility and rejection prevention. The most disturbing thing was a journal entry from when she was just 10 years old that said, "When we share organs, we'll be the same person and she can never leave me." Detective Walsh called me 3 days later while I was at work and told me they'd arrested Daisy's mother at the airport trying to board a flight to Mexico City. The FBI had been tracking her emails with an organ trafficking ring that operated out of a fake medical clinic in Tijuana, where she'd already wired $50,000 as a down payment for my kidnapping. She'd created a whole fake emergency scenario where Daisy would supposedly be dying in a Mexican hospital, and I'd rush down to help only to wake up missing a kidney in some warehouse. The agents found plane tickets in her purse with my name on them that she'd bought using my stolen credit card information, along with forged medical documents claiming I was Daisy's registered donor. Her laptop had dozens of emails discussing how to get me across the border without raising suspicion, and which sedatives would work fastest once they got me alone. The FBI expanded their investigation and found Daisy had recruited 2 nurses at my hospital who'd been feeding her my work schedule for months and alerting her whenever I changed shifts or took time off. These nurses had access to my employee records and had been photographing my time card and sending pictures to Daisy's phone every week. One of them admitted she'd been leaving the employee entrance door propped open so Daisy could sneak into the building after hours. The investigation uncovered chat logs going back 5 years where Daisy discussed her plans with various people she'd manipulated into helping by claiming I'd promised to donate but kept backing out. She'd created fake social media accounts pretending to be me where she posted about wanting to help my sick friend but being too scared to go through with surgery. Dr. Foster evaluated Daisy in the psychiatric ward and testified to the court that she had a delusional disorder where she genuinely believed we shared some kind of metaphysical connection that made my organs already hers. The psychiatrist explained that in Daisy's mind, refusing to donate wasn't just saying no, but was actively stealing something that belonged to her, like I was keeping her property hostage. She'd constructed this whole reality where we were destined to merge into one person, and my resistance was preventing us from achieving our true form. The support group for stalking victims met in a church basement downtown, and when I finally worked up the courage to share my story, the room went completely silent. Other members had dealt with ex-partners or coworkers, but nobody had experienced someone trying to literally harvest their organs through legal manipulation. One woman grabbed my hand and said she understood the feeling of someone believing they owned you and the terror of knowing they'd never stop trying to collect. Sharing the details out loud made me realize how long I'd been making excuses for Daisy's behavior and normalizing things that should have sent me running years ago. 2 weeks later, Rachel came over to help me redecorate, and we found more evidence Daisy had hidden throughout my apartment over the years. Behind picture frames were medical journals with kidney donation pages bookmarked and highlighted, with notes in Daisy's handwriting about recovery times and success rates. Under my mattress were photos of transplant patients smiling in hospital beds that she'd labeled Future US, with dates when we'd supposedly undergo each procedure. In my closet, we discovered a fake medical ID card she'd had made showing me as her official organ donor, with a forged signature and everything. The prosecutor called to tell me they were upgrading charges to attempted murder. Because Dr. Samuels had admitted the surgery would have been done without proper medical support or postoperative care. He testified that Daisy knew I could die from complications, but considered it an acceptable risk since she believed we were meant to share everything, including death if necessary. The evidence showed she'd researched which organs could be harvested even if the donor died during surgery, and had backup plans for getting my liver and corneas if something went wrong. Despite being hospitalized and supposedly too sick to use electronics, Daisy managed to get a phone smuggled in and posted a video online showing her dialysis wounds and claiming I was letting her die out of spite. The video went viral, with thousands of comments calling me selfish and heartless for not saving my dying friend when I had a perfectly good spare kidney. Protesters started showing up at my workplace with signs saying, "Save a life. Friendship means sacrifice." While Daisy played victim from her hospital bed, I had to testify before a grand jury about everything Daisy had done and brought boxes of evidence, including over 200 forged documents she'd created with my signature. I played recordings of conversations where she discussed drugging me and hiring people to kidnap me if necessary. The medical records showed how she deliberately damaged her kidneys with black market drugs to force the situation. The grand jury returned 8 felony indictments, including conspiracy to commit murder and organ trafficking charges that could put her away for decades. That night, Marcus took me to dinner at a quiet restaurant and pulled out a ring, saying he wanted to make sure I had legal protection as a spouse if anything happened. He said Daisy had tried to claim we were sisters, but he wanted to make sure the only person who could make medical decisions for me was someone I actually chose. A month later, Elena called in a panic, saying someone had hacked the organ donation database and added me to the deceased donor list, meaning if I died in any accident, my organs would automatically go to Daisy. The FBI traced the hack to Daisy's medical student ex-boyfriend, who'd used his hospital access to change my records and list Daisy as my next of kin with full medical power of attorney. 2 days later, the FBI arrested Garrett at his apartment, and he started talking before they even got him to the station. He led them to a storage unit outside Portland where Daisy had been keeping boxes of medical textbooks since we were 15. The walls were covered with charts showing blood types and organ compatibility between me and her, going back 10 years. There were folders labeled with different kidnapping plans, including one called Graduation Night and another called Wedding Day Extraction. Garrett showed them receipts for medical equipment Daisy bought with money she stole from her parents over the years. The next week, Marcus and I went to see a counselor who specialized in stalking victims. She had us write down all our daily routines and figure out new safety plans for everything from grocery shopping to walking the dog. Marcus kept checking the locks during our sessions, and the counselor said that was normal after what we'd been through. We practiced what to do if Daisy somehow got out on bail or if her family tried to contact us. 3 months later, Daisy's federal trial started at the courthouse downtown. She rolled into court in a wheelchair with a dialysis machine attached, looking like she was about to die. Her new lawyer stood up and said she was too sick to understand what was happening. The judge looked at her medical records and said the trial would continue. On the second day, a woman nobody expected showed up to testify. It was Daisy's aunt from Seattle, who the family hadn't talked to in 5 years. She told the court that Daisy's mother had demanded she give Daisy a kidney back then, and when she refused, they cut her out of the family completely. She played a recording from her phone of Daisy's mother screaming that real family members share organs without question. That night, I had a breakthrough with my therapist when I realized Daisy had been training me since we were 7 to feel responsible for her health. Every game we played as kids was about me saving her or giving her something. She'd pretend to be dying, and I had to give her my toys to bring her back to life. She made me practice signing my name on fake permission slips for field trips that were really consent forms she'd drawn up. 3 days into testimony, Daisy suddenly fell out of her wheelchair during the prosecutor's questions. Daisy falling out of her wheelchair during testimony is peak courtroom drama. Nothing says, "I'm innocent," quite like a perfectly timed medical emergency when the questions get too hard to answer. The court medics checked her and found she'd been holding her breath to make herself pass out. The judge ordered her handcuffed to the wheelchair after she tried to crawl toward me during the chaos. Detective Walsh took the stand next and showed photos of what they found in Daisy's mother's garage. There were bottles of sedatives stolen from the hospital where her mom worked and surgical tools she'd bought online. They found maps of my jogging routes with notes about blind spots where nobody would see a van pull up. The worst part was the rental agreement for a warehouse with a surgical table already set up and plastic sheets on the walls. People I hadn't talked to since high school started reaching out after seeing the trial on the news. 3 of our old friends came forward saying Daisy had tried to test their blood when we were kids. One girl remembered Daisy pricking her finger at a sleepover when she was 12 and putting the blood on a slide she'd stolen from science class. Another said Daisy told her in 10th grade that she was keeping a list of compatible donors for when she needed them. Dr. Foster testified on day 5 that Daisy understood exactly what she was doing. She explained that Daisy knew taking organs without consent was wrong, but believed her need was more important than my right to say no. The judge asked if this was insanity, and Dr. Foster said, no, it was entitlement mixed with obsession. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Marcus and I got married at the courthouse with just Rachel and 3 friends there. I wore my grandmother's ring that she'd left me when she died. The one thing in my life Daisy had never touched or tried to claim as part of our bond. The ceremony took 10 minutes, and we didn't tell anyone else we were doing it because we wanted something that was just ours, without any connection to the nightmare we'd survived. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom, gripping Marcus's hand so hard my knuckles went white. As the jury filed back in, the foreman stood up and started reading, and with each guilty verdict for Daisy, my whole body shook hard. Attempted kidnapping, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Attempted murder, guilty. Daisy shot up from her chair, screaming that I was murdering her and the whole jury was helping me kill her. The bailiffs grabbed her arms, but she kept fighting and kicking, yelling that they were all murderers who wanted her dead. They had to drag her out while she clawed at the doorframe, leaving bloody marks from her fingernails. Her mother's trial came next, and the prosecutor showed all the emails where she'd helped plan the kidnapping and bought the surgical equipment. The jury found her guilty of conspiracy, and at sentencing, she stood up and told the judge she'd do it again because real mothers would do anything to save their children, including sacrificing other people's children. The judge gave her 5 years, and she smiled at me as they led her away in handcuffs. I went back to work part-time the next week, and my supervisor had already arranged for security to walk me to my car every night. My coworkers brought me lunch so I didn't have to leave the building, and someone always stayed with me during breaks. The routine of checking patients and doing paperwork helped me feel normal again, even though I jumped every time someone came up behind me. 3 weeks later, at the state prison medical wing, Daisy got sentenced to 15 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment. The judge explained she'd get dialysis in prison, but was now at the very bottom of the transplant list because of her history of damaging her own kidneys and not following medical rules. She just stared at me the whole time like she was trying to burn holes through my skull with her eyes. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a victim impact statement I knew I'd never send. I wrote about mourning someone who never really existed and how the friend I loved was just a mask for her obsession. The person I thought was my best friend had always been planning to harvest my organs, and I'd been too blind to see it. A month later, Dr. Samuels pleaded guilty and told the court about 12 other illegal transplant operations he'd done over the years. He described a whole network of desperate people buying and stealing organs from victims who never knew they were being targeted. The prosecutor said I was lucky because some of his other victims had woken up missing kidneys in hotel bathtubs with no memory of how it happened. 6 weeks after the trial, I got a letter from the women's prison, but it wasn't from Daisy. Another inmate wrote that Daisy had been telling everyone I was her sister who was letting her die by refusing to save her life. She'd convinced 3 other inmates to write me threats, saying they'd find me when they got out if I didn't give Daisy my kidney. The FBI added witness intimidation charges to Daisy's sentence and moved her to solitary confinement. Rachel came over that weekend with a metal trash can and matches. We burned every photo and gift from Daisy in my backyard while drinking wine and crying. I kept one picture from when we were 7, playing in the sprinkler before everything went wrong. I told Rachel this was the friend I was mourning, not the monster she became. My lawyer filed a civil suit against Daisy's estate since she still had her college fund and an inheritance from her grandmother. The jury awarded me damages for therapy costs, security systems, and having to move to a new place. The judgment also included a permanent no-contact order that meant Daisy couldn't even have other people contact me for her. Marcus and I spent every weekend looking at houses in different neighborhoods where Daisy had never been. Each place we looked at, I checked for security cameras and deadbolts and how many exits there were. The realtor probably thought I was paranoid, but Marcus just held my hand and helped me measure distances from the street to the front door. I knew I'd always be looking over my shoulder and checking locks twice, but at least I was learning to live with that reality instead of letting it paralyze me. 6 weeks later, I was making coffee when Detective Walsh called with news that made me drop a mug on my kitchen floor. Daisy had been placed on suicide watch after guards found her in her cell with a sharpened toothbrush handle, trying to cut into her own side where a kidney would be. The ceramic shattered across the tiles while he read me the note she'd left, saying she wanted to die empty the way I'd left her. Marcus grabbed paper towels while I stood there shaking, because even locked up, she was still finding ways to hurt herself and blame me for it. That same week, Garrett finally got sentenced to 3 years for his role in helping Daisy. And during his statement to the court, he revealed something that made everyone in the courtroom gasp. He said Daisy had never planned to stop at just one kidney, but had detailed plans for what she called incremental harvesting, where she'd take organs from me over years, keeping me alive, but permanently connected to her body. The prosecutor showed the court Garrett's laptop with spreadsheets Daisy had made listing which organs could be taken in which order, and how long I'd need to recover between each surgery. She'd planned to start with a kidney, then take part of my liver 6 months later, then bone marrow, then skin grafts, then eventually one of my eyes. Garrett said she'd calculated exactly how much of me she could take while keeping me functional enough to keep producing more parts for her. I threw up in the courthouse bathroom while Rachel held my hair back. The next day, I found an online support group for people who'd been coerced or forced into organ donation and discovered this was way more common than I'd ever imagined. There were stories about parents who'd created savior siblings specifically to harvest from them, and people whose families had guilt them into donating by threatening to cut them off. One woman's husband had drugged her and tried to sell her kidney to pay gambling debts. Another person's mother had forged their signature on donation papers while they were in a coma. Reading their stories made me realize how many ways people could weaponize medical procedures against the people they claimed to love. Dr. Foster called me 2 days later from the prison psychiatric ward where they'd moved Daisy after the toothbrush incident. She said Daisy's kidneys had stabilized on dialysis, but she absolutely refused to accept that she'd never get my kidney and had created this whole fantasy where I'd eventually realize we were meant to be merged and would come to the prison to donate. Daisy had covered her cell walls with drawings of us as conjoined twins sharing organs and told other inmates I was her twin sister who'd abandoned her. The guards had to remove all sharp objects from her cell, including plastic utensils, because she kept trying to practice incisions on herself. Dr. Foster said Daisy truly believed our bodies were meant to be one organism that had been wrongly separated at birth. Marcus signed us up for self-defense classes the next week, and we spent Tuesday evenings learning not just how to fight, but how to spot danger before it got close. The instructor had been stalked for 2 years by an ex who tried to kidnap her 3 times, so she understood the constant fear of looking over your shoulder. She taught us how to vary our routes home and check for tracking devices on our cars and create safe words with trusted people. We practiced escape scenarios where Marcus would grab me and I'd have to break free using pressure points and momentum. The instructor showed us how to make our apartment harder to break into with door braces and window locks and motion sensors that would alert our phones. She said the goal wasn't to live in fear, but to make ourselves harder targets so stalkers would hopefully give up and move on. Talk about cutting out toxic friends way too literally. Daisy tried to perform surgery on herself with a prison toothbrush because apparently, professional medical kidnapping wasn't working out for her anymore. 2 months passed before I got the call that changed everything again. Daisy's aunt, the one who testified against her at trial, had contacted the prison offering to be tested as a kidney donor. She told them that despite everything Daisy had done, she didn't want her niece to die and felt obligated as family to at least try to help. The test results came back showing she was a perfect match, and she started the approval process to donate. I felt this weird mix of relief that someone else might solve Daisy's medical crisis, and guilt that her aunt was putting herself through surgery for someone who'd committed such horrible crimes. Marcus said it wasn't my fault that Daisy had destroyed her own body trying to force me to save her. But then Daisy refused the kidney completely, saying she'd rather die than accept an organ from anyone except me. The prison had to start force-feeding her when she went on hunger strike, and her lawyer filed an appeal claiming cruel and unusual punishment because they wouldn't let her die. The visitor logs showed she'd been telling everyone who'd listened that her aunt's kidney was contaminated and only my organs were pure enough to join with hers. She said accepting anyone else's kidney would be betraying our bond, and she'd rather die waiting for me than live with someone else's parts inside her. During all this, I decided to write about what happened to me and submitted an anonymous article to a medical journal about psychological manipulation in organ donation. Within a week, it had thousands of responses from doctors and nurses sharing similar stories they'd seen. One surgeon said he'd been pressured to do a kidney transplant between siblings where the donor was clearly being coerced, but the family threatened to sue if he refused. A transplant coordinator wrote about a mother who tried to register her disabled daughter as a donor without the daughter understanding what was happening. The stories kept coming about people who'd been emotionally blackmailed or physically threatened into giving up organs. Some hospitals had started requiring psychological evaluations for all living donors, but others said that just made families coach the donors on what to say. The appeal got rejected fast, with a judge writing that Daisy's refusal of a compatible kidney from her aunt proved this was never about medical need, but about control and possession. He said her sentence would stand and ordered her transferred to a federal facility with better psychiatric care, since she clearly needed more help than the state prison could provide. A year after the attempted kidnapping, I woke up on the anniversary and couldn't leave my bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daisy standing over me with that syringe and heard her voice saying she'd already picked which eye she wanted. Marcus called in sick to stay with me, and we spent the day watching old comedies and nature documentaries, avoiding anything medical. Rachel came over that evening with soup and wine and slept on our couch because she knew I'd have nightmares. 3 months passed before the detective called with news that made my stomach drop. Daisy had been writing letters from prison to other inmates with personality disorders and teaching them her methods for forging medical documents and manipulating hospital systems. The prison guards found stacks of handwritten instructions she'd created, showing exactly how to fake consent forms and which medications to use for organ damage. She turned her cell into a classroom for medical fraud and was building a network of people who believed organ sharing was the highest form of love. Detectives said they'd intercepted over 40 letters where she described step-by-step how to drug someone for a black market transplant. The warden moved her to solitary, but she kept finding ways to spread her ideas through the meal slots and during her dialysis treatments. That same week, a news crew showed up at my work asking for an interview about the organ trafficking documentary that featured our case. I had no idea they'd been filming, and suddenly my phone exploded with messages from strangers who'd seen the show. Some called me brave for standing up to her, but others said I was selfish for not saving my best friend's life with a simple kidney donation. Reporters waited outside my apartment, and my social media filled with death threats from people who thought I'd abandoned someone in need. I deleted everything and changed my phone number, but they kept finding me through work emails and Marcus's accounts. We started looking at houses immediately and found one in a gated community 40 miles away where nobody knew our names. The seller was an older couple moving to Florida who just saw us as young newlyweds starting fresh. We signed the papers quickly and packed our things at night to avoid the cameras that kept showing up. Moving day felt like escaping prison ourselves as we drove through the security gates of our new neighborhood. 2 weeks after we moved, the detective called to say Daisy had been caught saving her dialysis medications instead of taking them. She'd been stockpiling the pills in her mattress, planning to take them all at once for another suicide attempt. The medical staff found her unconscious in her cell with foam coming from her mouth and barely got her to the hospital in time. They put her in a specialized unit where nurses watched her 24 hours a day, and she had to take all medications in front of them. She couldn't even use the bathroom without someone checking she wasn't hurting herself. I tried to focus on our new life and started planting a garden in the backyard, choosing flowers and vegetables Daisy had never seen or talked about. Marcus helped me build raised beds, and we joked about growing carrots and peppers since they looked nothing like kidneys. Every plant I put in the ground felt like creating something that was completely mine, without any connection to her. We painted the house bright colors she would have hated and hung art she'd never understand. I was building a world where she'd never existed. Then the detective called with news that changed everything. Daisy's aunt had agreed to donate a kidney after Daisy's latest suicide attempt left her organs failing completely. The surgery was scheduled for next week, but Daisy insisted on writing me one last letter that her lawyer would hold until after the transplant. The detective said she'd written it during a lucid moment between medications and sealed it herself. The envelope arrived 3 days later, and I stared at it for hours. Dr. Foster warned me not to read it during our session, saying Daisy's words were designed to create psychological hooks that would last forever. Marcus offered to read it first and filter out any manipulation from genuine closure, but I couldn't decide if I wanted to know what she'd written. Part of me thought maybe she'd finally understood what she'd done wrong, but another part knew she'd probably just found new ways to hurt me. The transplant happened on a Tuesday and went successfully, though Daisy had complications from all the damage she'd done to her body over the years. The surgeon said she'd need medical supervision for the rest of her life and would serve her sentence in the prison medical ward. Her aunt refused any contact after the donation, saying she'd done her duty, but wanted nothing more to do with Daisy's obsession. The letter sat on our kitchen counter for 3 days before Marcus picked it up. He read it in the backyard while I watched from the window, and I saw his face get darker with each page. When he finished, he walked straight to the fire pit and burned it without saying anything. "There was nothing in there you needed to hear," he finally said when I asked. "Just more delusions about you two being connected forever and how you'd regret this choice." I felt relief wash over me, a profound, cleansing wave, knowing I'd never have those words in my head. 6 weeks later, I sat in my last session with a trauma specialist we'd been seeing since the trial. We'd worked through the guilt I felt about Daisy's condition and the years of conditioning that made me think I owed her my organs. The therapist reminded me one final time that I wasn't responsible for Daisy's choices and never had been. She'd chosen to damage her body and chosen to believe love meant cutting people open, and I'd simply chosen to keep myself whole. Walking out of that office felt like leaving a 20-year prison sentence behind. The next few weeks blurred together as I went back to work full-time and tried to find normal again. Marcus got promoted at his job, and we celebrated by going to the animal shelter where a scared golden retriever pressed against my legs like she knew I understood fear. We brought her home to join our first rescue dog and watched them become instant friends. I'd go entire days without thinking about Daisy, which felt impossible just months before. Detective Walsh showed up at our door one Tuesday morning with a thick folder and tired eyes. He sat at our kitchen table and went through every conviction one by one. Dr. Samuels got 20 years for organ trafficking and assault. The 2 men who helped him got 15 each. The black market network they'd been part of got completely shut down across 3 states. Daisy would serve at least 12 years before any chance of parole. "You're safe now," he said. The system worked. I started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends and shared my story with other women who'd been manipulated by people they trusted. One woman grabbed my hand when I described the forged medical documents because her ex-boyfriend had been trying to get her to sign papers she didn't understand. We went through them together and found consent forms for egg donation he'd been planning to sell. 3 months later, Rachel called crying, but they were happy tears this time. She was pregnant and wanted me to be the godmother. "I want my kid to know their aunt is the strongest person alive," she said. Prison pen pals for organ theft tips? Daisy turned herself into the world's worst TED Talk, complete with handwritten guides on how to steal kidneys from your friends. I sat on my kitchen floor and sobbed while Marcus held me. The official parole board letter came in a plain white envelope that I almost threw away thinking it was junk mail. Daisy's request for early release had been denied for the maximum period due to her continued psychological instability and refusal to accept responsibility for her actions. She wouldn't be eligible for review for another 5 years. I filed the letter away and realized my hands weren't shaking. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through our bedroom windows, and I was making coffee when it hit me that I hadn't checked the locks once all week. The need to look over my shoulder constantly was fading like a bruise, turning yellow then disappearing. I wasn't who I'd been before, but I was whole again. Marcus and I finally felt ready to have people over, so we invited friends for dinner at our new house. Everyone brought food and wine, and we laughed about normal things like bad movies and work drama. Nobody mentioned the trial or Daisy or anything that had happened. We were just a regular couple having a regular dinner party, and the normalness of it felt like winning the lottery. A year after the trial, Elena called from the hospital where she still worked as a transplant coordinator. They'd implemented new protocols based on my case that required multiple forms of identity verification and mandatory psychological evaluations for both donors and recipients. "Your story is saving people," she said. "Nobody will go through what you did at our hospital again." While cleaning out closets in the new house, I found a box Rachel had saved from our childhood. There were photos of me and Daisy at 8 years old, with missing teeth and grass-stained knees. Instead of anger, I felt sad for that little girl whose mother taught her that love meant cutting yourself open. I kept one photo to remind myself how far I'd come from that scared kid who thought friendship meant bleeding. The morning I knew I was really free was a random Saturday when I sat in our garden with both dogs sleeping at my feet. Marcus brought me coffee and kissed my forehead before starting to weed the tomato plants. Rachel's car pulled up, and she got out holding her new baby who had my sister's nose and our grandmother's eyes. The sun caught my wedding ring as I reached for my nephew, and I realized I hadn't thought about Daisy once that entire week. My mind was full of baby names and plant varieties and what to make for lunch. The scars on my psyche were still there like all scars, but they'd faded to thin, silver lines that only showed in certain light. I'd learned the difference between healing and forgetting because I'd never forget what happened, but I didn't need to carry it anymore. My life belonged to me now, with its garden and dogs and family dinners and ordinary Tuesday mornings. Daisy had tried to literally take pieces of me, but I'd kept myself whole and built something beautiful from what remained.